are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today's show is themed Once There Was a Strawman. And actually, a lot of us will encounter strawmen in our day-to-day living, especially if you try to stay abreast of current events. You're going to encounter strawmen because these are famously the argument that nobody was making. It's very easy to destroy. I'm going to show you some examples of what those strawmen look like, as well as just give you some basic ideas on how you can recognize them and avoid being bamboozled. So please understand, my number one goal here is not to make you frustrated or angry with people. I've had enough enemy-driven thinking, to last a lifetime in what I see in the media and in many years of working within the media. I don't want to give you demons to wrestle with. I do want to encourage you to think very clearly about what's going on around us and question everything. Everything I say, question it. I'm not going to be offended. I'm quite confident the truth can stand out on its own. Now, the first thing I want to bring to your attention is that critical race theory is up for discussion next week, and I'm actually a little bit excited in the sense this is going to be taking place in my backyard, so I'm probably going to attend this event. But it looks like former Attorney General Jim Jones, and he's kind of an enforcer of correct political opinion and ideology for the state of Idaho. At least that's the role he has taken on. He's going to be making a presentation in Twin Falls next Wednesday, October 5th. And it's defining and understanding critical race theory. Now, why is this so important? It's because despite the concerns that parents bring forward about, are they teaching our kids this? There always seems to be some wiggle room, and you'll find that there is no shortage of apologists who will say, well, it's not really being taught. And I'm going to explain to you why that wiggle room works in the favor of those who are actually promoting critical race theory and some of its fellow travelers, as well as being able to have plausible deniability and send parents, and for that matter, legislators, because sometimes states step up and say, well, we don't want this taught in the schools, but they're being taken on a wild goose chase. So I sincerely hope that Jim Jones is going to bring some light and truth to what he presents. I hope it doesn't just turn out to be an hour and a half of Jim-splaining, to us poor people who aren't smart enough to figure this out for ourselves. So let me give you an example of what it looks like to create cover for critical race theory. This is just from one article from KTVB television from back in February of this year. The headline, "The Idaho Freedom Foundation's influence could be felt most keenly last session on the subject of critical race theory. Brian Holmes, among others, is adamant that this is just false. It's not happening. It's not taking place." In fact, let me show you a few different quotes from various people who were interviewed for this article. Although the concept has been around for decades, it has become a conservative watchword in the last year or so for those who claim that it's a form of indoctrination designed to make white people feel ashamed or inferior. Opponents also say that CRT is being taught to Idaho children as young as preschool. Here's the first denial. That is not true, according to Idaho teachers at every level of education. Now, just want to point out, to make that more accurate, that line should be according to some Idaho teachers at every level of education, unless you want to believe that KTVB or Brian Holmes actually interviewed every single teacher at every level of education in the state of Idaho. He clearly didn't. And so there may be some truth to what he's saying, but it's not the whole truth, and this is important. Further on in the article, "That could not be further from the truth," said Heather Lee, who works for the Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children. Then you have Lori Facilla, executive director of the Giraffe Laugh Early Learning Centers, who was even blunter in her response. "Absolutely not. It's hard for me not to laugh at the idea," she said. And finally, critical race theory is not being taught on the K through 12 level either. Former president of the State Board of Education, Debbie Critchfield, said. Now this is 4 out of 5 of the denials just in this one article, but you get the point. Clearly, there is pushback against the idea that, this is not being taught. And if you were to say, well, okay, what about social emotional learning? Is that just, critical race theory, or again, some of that critical justice theory being peddled under another name? Well, this is why you have to be willing to ask questions and not just be content with this dismissal and waving of the hand. Oh, no, please don't worry about it. It's all under control. Now, as luck would have it, earlier this week, I had the opportunity to interview a man in Berlin, Germany, who just happened to have written a very informative article about why it's so essential to make sure you're dealing with the correct terms when it comes to critical race theory. This young man, it's not like he has a dog in the fight here in Idaho or anywhere else, but he does offer some very sound advice and for legislators who are trying to ban CRT in schools. He says, in a way, the state level action shows that federalism works. Different levels of government serve as checks and balances for one another. However, due to the diffusion of CRT ideologies throughout common English terms, or what he calls crossover words, banning CRT will prove as effective as eating soup with a fork. The best way to protect their children from these ideas is for parents to recognize the earmarks of CRT and for the state government to make sure it recognizes the freedom of these parents to educate their child as they choose. Can you see the distinction here? It's not saying these parents are up in the night. It's just saying you're looking at a moving target. And specifically, when it comes to truth, you actually have limits. Truth is finite. It's definable. It's something that has limits. Deception doesn't have any boundaries. So, we change a word here, we change a word there. Oh, see, well, it's really not critical race theory. So Torben Halbe explains CRT belongs to a wider set of leftist theories broadly labeled critical social justice, or CSG. And it's not as if the highly academic theories of CRT are explicitly taught in school, as critics of the Republican bills have been quick to point out. What we're observing instead is that certain CSJ themes are making their way into existing subjects. Now, one of the more prominent CSJ themes that's pervading public school history classes is the idea that the United States is founded in patriarchal and racist systems. Another common earmark of CSJ in school is the inclusion of queer theory in the class offerings, which considers any normality, like the notion that you're born a man or you're born a woman, to be oppressive, equating it with normativity. So your vocabulary is growing by the minute. You realize, oh my goodness, you really have to have a lot of depth in your vocabulary just to stay on top of this. Torben Halbe says proponents of critical social justice are excellently equipped for public discourse by using these crossover words. As Charles Pincourt and James Lindsay highlight in their book, Counter Woke Craft, a field manual for combating the woke in the university and beyond, these words have have a commonplace meaning, but also a radical CSJ meaning. So they can be used in debates and laws and find widespread agreement only to reveal their CSJ meaning later on. And then lawmakers find themselves trying to ban nice-sounding things like diversity or liberation, placing them on the back foot in lawsuits and in public debates. He says crossover words can also be used to introduce CSJ ideas into any academic subject. This is something you want to watch for with what's being taught in your kid's classroom. This is normally done by adding words like transformative or critical. For example, geography suddenly becomes critical geography, and the course will emphasize how white people destroyed the entire world. Critical is a crossover word itself because its woke meaning is total conformity to woke ideology. This new geography will then be taught as a high school subject. Critical biology classes will claim that seeing obesity as unhealthy is fatphobic. By finding oppression in everything, CSJ can circumvent the bans on race and sex by focusing on things like colonialism or healthism. You didn't even know that last ism existed, did you? By attempting to ban away CSJ theories and vocabulary, legislators and parents will find themselves in a never-ending game of cat and mouse. Now, he concludes by saying, because the principles of critical social justice can't be mitigated by legislation, informed parents should be allowed to protect their kids from these destructive ideas by choosing their own course of education. Parents ought to expect their government to support them however they choose to educate their kids. And I think that's probably a great place to remind you that when it comes to raising your kids, you really are the expert. Regardless of what people try to tell you. And sadly, legacy media is very much on the side of the expert class and the people in power. And they wouldn't want you to think that really you know what's best. But when it comes to your child, your doctor is not the one who has absolute authority. Your kid's teacher when it comes to their education is not the one with absolute authority. You as the parent are the one that has the authority to find out, and I hope, research and determine what is best for your kids and not be swayed by, people waving their credentials under your nose. Well, don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I know? You might be able to learn something from them. And there may be some people out there with expertise that's genuinely helpful for what you're trying to do for your child. But let's not forget, the buck stops with you as the parent, and that means that these other experts have to take a back seat to your authority. That's troubling to authoritarians. Maybe that makes sense to you, maybe it doesn't. But now you understand. It's the little semantics that allow them to give that plausible deniability. We're not really teaching CRT. We're just teaching a certain wing of it. But they're not going to tell you that. So you need to be willing to ask questions. You need to be skeptical enough to start questioning these kinds of things and be comfortable with if people pushing back and, well, how dare you ask me about that? But again, if you're the authority, if it's your kid, you kind of have the prerogative to do so. Let's talk a little bit about strawmen. This is something that all of us encounter. You have thoroughly destroyed the argument that nobody made. And we see this so many different places where, I think one of the biggest ones that I'm seeing right now is the fact checkers that are checking everything that comes up about COVID or that comes up about vaccines and so forth. And the idea here is a simple misstatement of what someone has said or a policy that's been enacted is usually enough to, start the destruction process. You have to be careful and make sure that you are defining the terms and making those who are arguing against you define their terms. Now, if it sounds like I'm describing an adversarial situation, you would have to, you'd have to just acknowledge that, yes, sometimes it's necessary to step up and be somewhat adversarial. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be rude and loud and in people's face. You just have to be confident enough that it's okay to ask this question. And if someone gives you kind of a halfway answer, don't be satisfied with it. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. This is an article from a writer by the name of, it's an Icelandic name, so it's going to take me a running start to get this, Thorstein Siglason. What an excellent article he has, though, in the Daily Skeptic, talking about how to recognize straw man as it's applied by journalists as well as fact checkers. He says, recently, the Danish health authorities decided to stop making COVID vaccines and boosters available to the general population under the age of 50. Note, the general population, not absolutely everyone under 50. Now, this interesting development and the fact that the rationale for this decision has not been properly explained has clearly wrought havoc among those whose day job it is to protect the reputation of those medications. He goes on to say, Flora Teo, the science editor of the fact-checking website Health Feedback, has now written an article which supposedly refutes the standard summary of this decision. In other words, the Danish health authorities have banned vaccines and boosters for nearly everyone under the age of 50. Teo's article is a typical fact-checking piece because she starts by stating a claim, Denmark banned COVID-19 vaccines for anyone under 50, which she then proceeds to refute. But here's the problem. No one actually made that claim. Can you see where you can quickly get sidetracked? Two sources are listed, although the facts being checked are both supposedly contained in a headline above a video and a tweet linking back to an article, but not in the YouTube video and article themselves. Trying to connect dots that really don't line up there. The first headline, which refers to a video by Clay Travis, reads, Denmark bans COVID shot for people under 50 years old. The second, which is a tweet posted on Toby Young's account, linking to a piece by Thorstein Siglason in the Daily Skeptic, reads, Denmark has banned the use of COVID-19 vaccines for people under 50, saying the benefits are too low. What it conspicuously fails to mention, though it surely knows it, is that the risks are also too high. Now, the article goes on to say, unfortunately, neither the headlines or the tweet state what Teo claims they state, namely that Denmark has banned the COVID shots for anyone under 50. Now, the word anyone is crucial here. Instead, all that's being claimed is that the vaccines have been banned in general for people under 50, and the discussion that follows in both cases contains details on which under 50s are actually exempt from this ban. And those are, in effect, headlines. So this was very helpful to me. Headlines routinely generalize and exaggerate the contents of videos and articles they're flagging up. Why wouldn't they, right? The goal of a headline is to capture you and get you to click on it or to at least dig deeper and read. So here are some examples. Food crisis if we ditch Russian oil, the Times proclaimed on September 19th, 2022. While the article itself details that this is, in fact, the opinion of one central banking institute. In other words, it's not a fact that ditching Russian oil means food crisis. It's the opinion of some. Now, this doesn't just apply to the political left. So we'll give a little bit of pushback here to the political right as well. High-profile Dems silent when asked about housing migrants, Fox News said in a headline the same day. But if you read the main text, it turns out that this doesn't apply at all, or to all, rather, high-profile Democrats. Only a handful. Now, if Fox News had said all high-profile Dems silent, its headline would be wrong, but it doesn't. So the headline isn't wrong. Now, by the same token, while Denmark's ban on COVID shots for people under 50 applies to almost everyone, there are a few exceptions. Headlines are headlines. Branding a video description or a tweet as misinformation because they contain condensed or generalized information with a more detailed discussion in what follows has nothing to do with checking facts. It's just about creating straw men, especially when the fact checker even distorts the quoted headline to make it fit her narrative. And that's exactly what Flora Teo did in her article by adding the crucial word, anyone. Flora Teo's article has nothing to do with checking facts or correcting wrong statements. All it has to do with is creating and then attacking straw men. By distorting headlines, ignoring the crucial difference between headlines and the text they refer to, and presenting a number of unsubstantiated or false statements, her key takeaway doesn't even address the issue in question. It's simply pure propaganda for the vaccines. Now, that may seem removed from you and I, but it's really not, because this is how carefully you have to be willing to read whatever media you're consuming. And I'm not just going to say just the legacy media, or just, the left-wing media. By the way, have you noticed that, if you're not far left, you're automatically considered far right? That seems to be one of the common themes that we're seeing right now in Idaho's legacy media for some reason. And it just seems to serve the purpose of keeping us divided. It's politicizing news stories in ways that maybe don't reflect reality. So having a healthy sense of skepticism is actually a very good thing. It'll keep you out of trouble, and more importantly, it keeps us from getting mired in that enemy-driven thinking that seems to be underlying just about everything that we encounter these days, particularly what we see in the media or in social media. So I have a couple of quotes that I want to share with you from one of my favorite writers, a guy who just exudes common sense, a guy by the name of Kent McManigal. He says, if you distrust your neighbor because of political differences, it's not your neighbor or you who's at fault. It's politics. Now, some would have you believe we're at war with each other, but your neighbors aren't the enemy, even if they follow the enemy, or if you do, for that matter. He says, don't let politics make you hate each other. That would be a tragedy. And I think that the key here is sometimes stories are written with a very open, incendiary slant, and sometimes it's a little more subtle. Sometimes it's just the little details. I was looking on the Idaho Statesman's website, saw an article from back towards the beginning of September, and it shows Ammon Bundy again fails to show up for court. And look, that's not really big news. I mean, it's a true story. He didn't show up. There's a civil lawsuit that has been filed by St. Luke's, and Ammon has not participated in those proceedings. But what makes it subtle deception, and the reason I say there is deception here, is it was filed under the crime category for the Statesman. Okay, last I checked, there is a difference between civil and criminal justice. Now, in a criminal trial, when there's something going on in court and you are subpoenaed to come to court, you have to show up. So on the trespassing charge that Ammon faced, he did show up for court. But on the civil one, there's no need. There really isn't. And I know St. Luke's and others who are like, well, we want to sue him and we want to make sure he pays for calling attention to, the judge and the child protective service workers and the police and the doctors who took this little boy away from his parents unjustly. And Ammon says, if they can present that to the jury and the jury says, yep, well, we agree, then he says they'll just render some kind of summary judgment. But he doesn't really need to be there. So I'm not trying to make the case, and therefore Ammon is 100% right here. I'm just saying, don't you think that it's important that an established news source like the Idaho Statesman would get something like this correct? But by posting it under crime, you're supposed to associate the fact, well, Ammon didn't show up for court. That must be a crime. But in fact, with a civil trial, it's not. Okay? It's the little things. The devil is in the details. And if you want to be a person who's not being hoodwinked or bamboozled by very skillful manipulators of language, very skillful people who use sophistry as part of their daily routine, you've got to be on your toes. Now, that means you can't outsource letting somebody else tell you what to think. Just like I'm not trying to tell you what to think, but I'm definitely encouraging you, think harder, think more clearly, think more independently, and be totally willing to ask questions about what's going on before you give your, okay, there's my approval or there's my allegiance. There's a ton of deception going on, and it's really on you. In fact, I want to go back to a comment that was made earlier. Andrew had asked, when it comes to parents really being the ones in charge of what their kids are being taught, asked, well, wouldn't this lead to crazy ideas to perpetuate into kids' education? You mean like that men can dress like women and actually be women? I mean, not that that's a crazy idea, but yeah, he actually uses the example. What about those crazy positions like the Holocaust didn't happen or that America didn't oppress people of color? If those things are being taught, then somebody has an agenda that parents would probably, I would assume, remove their children from the school, unless you're just suggesting, Andrew, that parents are too helpless and can't make their minds up on things like this on their own. See, you can't outsource things like the responsibility for making sure your children grow up to know how to think critically and independently as well. But if you're going to insist that your children grow up to know how to think and weigh things for themselves, you probably better be willing to model that behavior for them. The problem is we have kind of come to see government as the supreme problem solver. If something comes up, well, we've got to get government involved, and we've got to make that happen. Okay, Andrew's clarifying, saying I'm saying there are parents out there pushing these views. That doesn't mean other parents are going to have to accept it. Look, part of the privilege of thinking for yourself means that you're going to be exposed to wrong ideas. And again, the lazy part of us that says, well, but we've got these experts teaching our kids, I can trust them to teach them the right thing. Are you sure about that? Because I think you're going to find more crazy ideas being pushed from the official corners of education than you are from parents. I mean, what kind of platform, what kind of standing do those parents have in terms of setting the curriculum for an entire classroom or an entire school district full of students? They don't. So set the example for yourself. In fact, this brings me actually to the final quote that I want to share with you from Kent McManigal, because this would head off so much trouble if people could just get their minds around this simple truth. If you are trying to govern anyone but yourself, your own individual life, you're the problem, no matter which side you think you're on. If you found yourself, stressed about, oh, everything's so politicized, everything is so polarized these days, it's true. There's a lot of polarization, and there's just more than enough to go around. But the moment that you start trying to control other people, whether it be through the political process, through the vote you cast, or through policies that you urge or try to support, you're stepping out of your lane. Focus on governing yourself. Try to use your influence as wisely as you can, but recognize people have the right even to be wrong. The only place we draw the line is where there is measurable, provable harm, where you can actually show a victim. And that's what our justice system exists for, is to help make things right in that instance. Otherwise, it just comes down to meddling. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
that